Hi, welcome to valuationpodcast.com, a podcast and video series about all things related to business and valuation. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I provide divorce, mediation, and valuation services in St. Louis, Missouri. Today, we will actually discuss environmental, social, and governance policies, or ESG policies, and its effect on valuations with Mark Zyla. Mark Zyla is a valuation expert in Georgia, and he's the managing director of Zyla Valuation Advisors, an Atlanta valuation and litigation consulting firm. He's also the chairman of the Standards Review Board for the International Valuation Standards Council. He was also one of the primary authors of the education program that the AICPA and the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors for the credential, which is Certified in Entity and Intangible Assets, or the CEIV, which basically certifies valuation professionals in the valuation for financial reporting purposes. Welcome, Mark. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me to your podcast, Melissa.
Yeah, this is awesome. I think we're really talking about an area that may be a little nuanced in valuation, but that's what we're here for, right? And it may be an area that is kind of up and coming. So there's more emphasis on this environmental, social, and governance policies in investing. But how do you see this start to even impact the business valuation profession?
Sure. I think this is an area that business valuation specialists need to be aware of. It's something that we're seeing trends in other areas like investment funds, the accounting profession starting to take notice, and it's eventually going to impact valuations and how we do our work. So I think valuation specialists, while it's still evolving, need to be aware of this trend and how the profession's responding to it.
Well, and trends are great. Like we always want to stay on top of it, but like even I don't totally understand what we're talking about, right? Like I get the words environmental or social or governance policies, but what specifically is ESG and its implication for business owners?
Well, ESG is a trend, is a nomenclature that encompasses the trends for socially responsible corporate policy. So it can, we're all familiar with the E part, the environmental part, with how corporate policy may impact the environment in terms of carbon emissions or deforestations or use of water, use of energy. But there's also components of social components. For example, we saw in the last year and a half the social justice movement and trends like more diversity in the workplace. And those have impacts on corporate policy and also have impact on eventually on cash flows and valuation. And then lastly, there's governance, which is how companies respond to these particular trends through their own policy. So it may be things like setting up a sustainability program or having things like a whistleblower program or executive compensation. And each of these, the reason why we lump it all together, it's being lumped together under the umbrella of ESG, is that there are different impacts. On one area may have an impact on another. So for example, environmental issues may have a direct impact on corporate governance, and corporate governance may have an impact on the social aspects of a business.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that it's interesting because I think the world is shifting, and there are a lot of times, just like in a traditional valuation, right? Just normal schmormal. We say, oh, you have contributions, or you have, so you're giving back to the community. Are those business related or are they not business related? Mm-hmm. And a lot of times you will see that they're trying to combine like okay, we're going to invest in this area because it benefits our practice, but is it necessary for the business operations? Are we kind of talking about some of that, or is it even different? Like, do you have specific examples of these types of policies in business, or are they connected, or am I?
No, I think you're right on. I think that's a large part of it. But some examples, like for example, would be examples like DuPont is has a goal of reducing their carbon emissions by a certain percentage by 2030, and they're doing deals with renewable energy firms to power their plants. We see Volkswagen has made an effort to convert to all electric cars by 2030. We're seeing things like activist investors becoming more active on boards, like, for example, Mobile Exxon, to reduce the carbon footprint of oil companies. And so we see these trends, and these trends will eventually impact corporate policy, which will impact cash flow, risk, growth, the three traditional basic measurements that determine valuations. And so we as the valuation profession need to be aware of these growing trends and how it impacts on the work we do.
Yeah, and part of it is directly related to financial reporting, so a lot of this is all directed to this. And I'm trying to even figure out in regular business valuations, like how it impacts, because in my mind, in some capacity, we've talked a lot about business valuations in the past of how like the past is no longer indicative of the future, but we also have metrics and benchmarking, right? That kind of talk to what is normal expenses. Like, do you see some of these basically, or maybe in some other, do you see these corporate policies impacting the valuations? Like, or are we looking at that companies are going to have to spend more in general to be like active corporate responsible participants in the world? And is that going to eventually change the benchmarking because of some of those issues?
Yeah, I mean, all of that. See, I like to think of it in terms of, again, the three kind of components of valuation. It's the cash flow the company generates. So these corporate policies will likely impact the cash flow. So in some areas, be increased investment, which increases capital expenditures, which may initially reduce cash flows, but have a long-term positive impact. It may impact risk. It may lower cost of capital. There are academic studies that purport to show that having a positive social policy will eventually reduces cost of capital, which increases value. And then long-term growth rates. There may be things such as simply as, if you don't have these policies, how is this going to impact your long-term viability as a company? So each of these factors eventually impact the three basic components of valuation. And there's ways as valuation specialists we can look at those. Right now, the profession, we're looking at frameworks, like how does it impact the top line? If we have favorable policies, will people buy more product from us so we have a higher revenue? If we're more aware of energy costs or costs of use of water, does that lower our cost structure so we have a better bottom line eventually because of these policies? Some factors maybe is our workforce. Is it our training costs, our hiring costs may be lower because they want to work for companies that have these positive policies. So our retention of our skilled workforce, so it perhaps reduces our company's labor costs. So each of these policies eventually have a cash flow impact, which obviously has an impact on the overall valuation.
Okay, that is really helpful to understand, because I think as we're talking about it, basically these are going to be corporate values that are going to potentially be more valuable going forward but there's still a cost involved in it.
That's right.
And so if we took like one particular one, so I know you just talked about a lot of them, but if could we take one and kind of walk through how it could, like if there's something that you've seen a lot, how does one of those corporate policies kind of go through and impact the valuation of that firm? Could you kind of walk us through? Because I mean, to me, this is like this really is changing currently how business is done. And going forward, not only are you going to want to work for certain companies, but are you going to want to buy their products? Are you going to want to invest in them? Are you going to want to do all this? From a corporate standpoint, they have to focus on this. But if we look at any of these corporate policies, and maybe one that you see more often, can you walk us through the impact?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, an example might be like Volkswagen and their shift to entirely manufacturing electric cars. So that's a pretty substantial change in business model. And so it's going to require an investment in different types of auto parts for their cars. It's going to require some retooling. It's going to require an investment in, if not Volkswagen, somehow by society, an investment in charging stations as the automobile transfers more to electric type vehicles. So it requires an investment in initial investment in infrastructure, but they may be able to charge more for cars and may benefit the top line. It may induce investors to invest in that company because they want to invest in those types of policies. So it may eventually reduce the cost of capital. Other examples might be impact on supply chains. For example, Apple wants their suppliers to be carbon neutral by 2030. So if you're a supplier to Apple, you have to start implementing processes in place to achieve that goal by 2030, or you may not be able to work with Apple. So we're seeing ripple effects on different companies because of these policies.
Well, and so if we follow that same logic, is that all of this investment or capital expenditures or, research and development, all of these are kind of categories of expenses in the business valuation. And so what you're telling me is right now, for them to invest in the future or some profitability in 5 or 10 years, that there's going to be a huge outlay of cash at this point. And in just like simple, basic valuation theory, less cash flow, less value. So what does that even mean? Like these businesses are worth less because they're focused on the future, or what?
Or they actually may be worth more. It's going to be so what it's up to the valuation specialist to work with management to understand the impact of these policies on the expectations, the cash flow expectations, the risk expectations going forward, which are the basics of valuation. So it sounds like there may be a lot of upfront investment. In certain cases, there may be, but there's also a cost. If you don't do that, what happens? Are you out of business? You can't just have cash flows into perpetuity if you're making gas-powered cars when the world changes away from gas-powered cars. You're not going to be in business. If you don't have if you're a technology company and you don't have a social policy to attract a diverse workforce, you're not going to attract the best and the brightest. So it's going to impact not only your hiring costs and your retention costs, but it may impact your developments because you're not hiring people who can develop the next couple of generations of products. So it may impact your long-term viability and your competitiveness if you're unable to do that. So it has a lot of ripple effects. So there's some direct impact on valuation. There's some that are indirect, and then there's some that establish a framework for the continued viability of the company. And what valuation specialists need to be aware of is this change is happening, and eventually it's going to impact valuation. So you need to start thinking about it in terms of a framework and thinking about it how it eventually might impact your evaluation, your work, and what questions to ask.
Yeah, because it really, like if I'm thinking conceptually, how do we put this into play? It is questions about what are you doing, but in some capacity, this is also in how you project. Like if you're doing a discounted cash flow method, which a lot of times in financial reporting you're doing, right? So you're actually it's not only just like, hey, do you have this policy in play? It's more so this policy requires certain influx of money or outflow of money or something happening over time. So you're also trying to categorize, like, at what point will we have completed the first part of an investment? And then when will we see the cash flow? And then when will we see the next run? Because nothing ever is forever.
That's right.
So is that part of some of the questioning is important to also help do some of the projections as well?
It is, and it's just an awareness of kind of going back to some of the things that we saw with the mandatory performance framework in terms of the responsibility of the valuation specialist and projection. So understanding to make sure that the forecasts are appropriate for use in the valuation. So it may be things just asking, what is your Mr. Management, or Miss Management, what is your ESG policy? And how do you see that impacting these cash flows? Here's what we see other companies in your sector doing. How do you compare to what they're doing? And if you don't compare favorably, how's that going to impact your business in the long term? Well,
because, and that's what I'm trying to get at a little bit, is that we don't have the proper benchmarks. So if now all of a sudden you've hired an executive, right, for diversity, and you have, or even an owner, you now have sort of a different cost structure that if you looked at and compared to other people, be like, oh, we're 10% or 5% more in our salaries and our wages, when the reality is you might not be completely, like, that might be the normal going forward. So what are some of the challenges of how we actually measure this impact of these policies on value? And do we even have benchmarking or anything out there yet to kind of help with that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The trend in a lot of ways, even though it's been 10, 15 years, in some cases, is still in its infancy. So it's occurring quickly. The economic impacts of the pandemic have accelerated this trend. However, the biggest challenges, which you just hit on, is standardization of measurement. First of all, if you think about measuring ESG and how it relates to valuation, there's three parts. One is measuring the impact of these policies themselves. And there are rating agencies that rate various environmental, social, and governance policies of companies and provide benchmarks for that. However, the challenge with that first is when you compare, say, a rating agency for like corporate bonds, so like a Moody's or a Fitch or a Standard & Poor's, generally they come to very similar conclusions. So there's a lot of correlation between those agencies in rating debt and risk. When you have the rating agencies for ESG, at least currently, these agencies have different focus, so they're not nearly as correlated. And so there are some challenges, first of all, just measuring impact of ESG. The second challenge is, how is that disclosed? And right now, the accounting profession is becoming more heavily involved in disclosures and financial reporting of ESG, which is great news for valuation experts. However, they're not there yet. So, but some examples, some very positive examples, is the IFRS, the International Financial Reporting System, the from the International Accounting Standards Board is developing an international sustainability standards board. That would be a sister board to the organization that issues accounting standards. So they're going to set up reporting standards for ESG or sustainability measures so that there's consistency across financial reporting for these type of issues. So that's the good news. The International Organization of Securities Regulators, IOSCO, has endorsed this process, and they're actively focused on these kind of standards. So, but more reporting, better reporting of sustainability efforts by corporations, and having consistency and reliability across companies. So that's good news for valuation experts. Now, the issue for valuation for us as a profession is, okay, once we have all this information in place, assume that we start getting better information, is how do we utilize that information? How does it impact valuation? So I think once we start getting better reporting, better disclosures, we can assimilate it in the basic framework of valuation that currently exists. Okay. So it's not going to change how we do the work, but it's going to change the inputs and things like questions that we ask, and making sure we're comfortable with the efforts and how it's going to impact eventually on the inputs to our valuations.
But realistically, I think what you said was two pieces, and we've just talked about the one piece, but there is an implication for cash flow. And we've kind of talked about that. And that seems logical. You know, we have to invest in these areas to be better. And there are places that even our consumers didn't put heavy importance on. And now everybody's, you know, I mean, single-use plastics, for example, you know, like it's always been an issue of we use too much plastic, but now it's more of a focus of like, okay, how can we remove that? Well, you have more people actually buying cups that they can reuse, right? Well, it takes us to be involved in it. But I think the piece that maybe we didn't talk about that you also said was that this has an implication for risk. And yes. I think that's the harder one. And realistically, even if you have bodies that are putting together benchmarking, you know, this comes kind of in with company specific risk premium, right? That you're going to have your own sort of internal somewhat consistent measurement of how that impacts risk, because you're going to see a bunch of different valuations, you know, like instead of going and saying, oh, well, it should make you 2% less risky. It's really going to be like, totally, how much do I see that this impacts the risk from a bigger? Do you want to talk about any of that?
Yeah, no, those are excellent points. One example, as far as cost of capital, one issue is, or an example of the impact of this is, Morningstar did a study and looked at funds that had a sustainability or an ESG focused, and compared rates of return on those funds compared to peer groups that didn't have that particular focus. And they found in some cases the rates of return may be 20% higher for the socially responsible funds. So there could be a lot of different reasons for that. Could be people want to invest in those funds, it's attracting more capital. It could be that investors are aware of the risk of not implementing these policies, so they're looking at those companies as riskier. But there are there's empirical evidence of rates of return for social responsibility. And to your point, that in more practical use for valuation specialists is things like how we develop our cost of capital. It may not be just company-specific risk, but it may be things like beta. So, for example, if we're using guideline companies to develop beta, if all the guideline companies have strong social policies in place and we think in general that their risk is less, their rates of return may be higher. If we're using it to develop a cost of capital for a company that doesn't have a strong policy, how do we make adjustments for that? Things like that. So it just increases, and it's part of the normal stuff we should be doing anyway, but it's just a different set of questions or different issues that we as valuation specialists need to think about.
Well, and you've said before that this was something that you were pretty passionate about, and it could be, and like you said, it's not like, 10, 15 years, people have said that some sort of social and environmental kind of investment is a good process. But, the valuation expert needs to be aware, like that is a perfect example of guideline company. I think as it continues to be important to even know that there have been studies done that said that these are more profitable, that is very helpful information, but also then determining how you apply it. I think one other piece is that what are the assets that we normally, so to me, this is kind of like a guidepost of, hey, valuation expert, you maybe haven't dealt with this in the past. So you need to look at the impact on cash flow. You need to look at the impact on risk. Depends on whether you're doing, a whatever model you use for your risk factor, right? Weighted average cost of capital, whatever it is, you need to understand it. I don't know if I would have even thought so far of the guideline company, because we're also doing that for transactions, right?
Sure.
And that's an important piece. But are there certain assets which may be directly impacted that you're seeing very often by these ESG corporate policies that we should also be looking at?
Yeah, there are. And to your point about cost capital and this trend, just a couple of anecdotes. There was a study done of the S&P 500. Something like 90% of those companies have an ESG policy or a social policy. So it's becoming more and more prevalent among companies. And there's another one I found interesting is that the shoe manufacturer Allbirds, they underwent an IPO recently, and their prospectus, according to one article, they use the term ESG 91 times. So we're seeing trends that companies are focusing on these policies. So it's something that's happening. It's not, some esoteric, just a feel-good kind of thing. It's actually occurring. But as far as particular assets that are impacted by corporate policies, if you think about the companies, there's a framework. The IVSC, the International Valuation Standards Council, has put out a series of perspective papers written primarily by Kevin Prahl on these issues. And their suggestion with the IVSC is develop a framework to think about these policies on valuations, and think about it in terms of assets like brands. So the stronger a company's brand has, the more impact an ESG policy would have on its overall valuation. Human capital and technology companies that need to retain workforce, the more you have a need for human capital and a highly trained workforce, the bigger the impact ESG policies have on it. Things like customer relationships, if you're directly to consumers and you're seen as a socially responsible entity, you may be able to charge higher prices because people want your product, or your cost structure may be lower because you're more efficient in how you use your resources. Tangible assets, if you use a lot of tangible assets, that's a little bit more difficult to implement stronger policies, but there are intangible assets indications that environmental buildings and such, can charge higher rents and have higher occupancy. in technology, if you're more technology driven, you might be able to focus more on ESG policy. So they think about it in terms of framework. And at the end of the day, it primarily impacts intangible assets. And so if you think about environmental policies, it may impact your brand, that people are attracted to your brand, which tracks human capital. Your workforce wants to work for you because you're socially responsible company, and people want to work for the good guys. So indirectly it impacts human capital. It may impact your customers because in addition to the brand, it strengthens your relationships with your customers. So we see a lot of the enhancements in value from ESG impacting those type of intangible assets. But also it could impact tangible assets, things like, as I mentioned, buildings. There's studies that show, in fact, tangible assets may be a little bit further ahead as far as the impact of these policies, because there's studies that show, their higher occupancy in green buildings, higher rents, those type of things, which, obviously enhance values.
Well, and I think that, to your point, these things have been around for a while, but I think that society is catching up. And the reality is, it doesn't really matter if I build a green building or a neighborhood of green buildings if there's nobody buying green buildings.
That's right.
And so I think we just have had a disconnect for a long time of, like, companies are actively investing in these programs, are actually doing them, maybe at the behest of the employees or management. But from a value perspective, we haven't had the consumers put value in place for that, right? Like, you can always shop around, you can always purchase based on your value system, but you haven't really always had to. And we haven't put a lot of pressure on that. It's like, I don't care. I like their chicken. I don't care what their belief system is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those types of things. But have you even seen corporations start to reevaluate, almost like have a pool of money that they're saying, okay, we're going to need to do something with this. What is it that is going to have the most impact? Like, do you see companies actually start to look and say, okay, well, we've seen that social things have more impact, we're going to do that? Have you seen that kind of thought process go through companies?
Yeah, if you look at corporations in their public disclosures, they're now disclosing their ESG policies. So you can follow it from those disclosures, their thought process and what they view as the most important. And I think in most situations, they see the interrelationship between the E, S, and a G. For example, if you're DuPont and you don't pay attention to the E part, the G part, the government's going to, governance, if you might face increasing regulation. So your governance issues may change. If you don't have the appropriate environmental policies, you may not be able to track employees, those kind of issues. So it's all interrelated.
Have you seen any delay in a corporate ESG policy? Because, and I'll give the example, like, I had an electric car. I've had electric cars a lot over the past 10, 15 years, right? Currently don't, but in the past did. And in the past, you, as an automaker, you could be like, we're going to do electric or not, right? You could make that decision. And now I think it's shifting that, a lot of makers, car makers, automobile makers that maybe didn't choose to lean into that are now being dragged in some capacity. So do you see a lag in being proactive start to basically lower the value of a company?
Yeah, I think so. I think companies are being more proactive. So I think the policies are being implemented today. I think the measurement of the impact of those policies is by rating agencies is a little bit of a catch up. The accounting standard setters are just starting to determine what needs to be disclosed, and then valuation professionals need to know what's going to, once we get all this data, how do we utilize that to measure its impact on value. So I see that the policies are being implemented. So it's, as valuation specialists, the message, I want to convey to them is, this stuff's coming. So start thinking about it. Even though the information's not perfect at this particular point. But it just an example, the companies are looking at the impact of these policies on pricing. And so they've done marketing studies that show that measure at what level are consumers willing to pay a higher price for a product that is viewed as socially responsible product compared to a peer. And there are certain price points that consumers are willing to pay. And so companies are seeing the benefits of implementing these policies.
So even asking those questions, I think, are important. Is, have you done a recent pricing analysis? Have you considered changing your prices for something? Because there could have been. It also makes me think that there's going to be the threshold of what you should, right? I don't like to use that word, but what we think corporate responsibility is about is going to shift. And you're now, maybe there was a threshold of do nothing, right? And now you're going to have this expectation. So I almost think at some point you're going to have companies that do not have some sort of ESG policy. And people are going to be like, oh, well, you're only part of that 10% that's not doing it, eventually. And I think that we as valuation people have to say, okay, will investors say, well, if you're part of that 10% that has no policy, how can I actually warrant putting money into this company if I know at some point it's going to affect you? If it hasn't already, because the implication is that it has already, that there are either less people purchasing your products or you're hitting a price competition issue, right? So
yeah, I think one of the questions that valuation specialists, but even more importantly, the companies themselves need to ask is what happens if you don't implement these policies? I mean, are you putting your company at risk, for its actual survival if you don't implement these? Because you're inviting increased regulation. You may not be able to track the workers. Your people may not buy your stuff. You may see, your revenues declining because you have a bad reputation. Things like that.
But as we come in, if we're the valuation professionals, and what else can we do to kind of help assist other than coming in, to a company and saying, hey, this doesn't look as good. And a lot of these financial reporting is for a transaction, right? And so you have maybe one company that is more environmentally sound than the other, and the implications. So what else do we need to do to really understand the amount of effect, right? I mean, because we're asking questions, but are we really saying, hey, you guys could be worth less because you didn't do this? Arguably, these are large companies. They should have a clue, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So what else should we be doing to even understand how it affects our work?
Yeah, I think from a valuation specialist standpoint, you need to be aware, these trends. And I think, you see them in the media. So we know these are happening, but you need to understand that corporations are taking this very seriously, and they're implementing policies to address these issues. And those policies are likely to have cash flow, either cash flow or risk or growth impact. And obviously that's going to have an impact on the valuation. So as a valuation specialist, you need to start thinking about incorporating that in your normal valuation process. You know, it's not expanding or changing anything the way you do your work, but it's thinking about it in a different manner, or thinking about these other factors, and then thinking about a framework. Okay, you know, this company is you know, computer manufacturer or something. You know, here's their ESG policies. Let's look at what other companies are doing in this particular sector. Let's see if this stuff makes sense. Let's talk to management, how they see it impacting their eventual, you know, their expectations of cash flow.
Well, and is this part of what we are going to maybe, you know, like this is part of this CEIV credential. So is this credential going to start to address some of these things, like in the framework? Because I think, you know, at a minimum, we can say if you're in this line of work, you need to have questions. You need to be asking them about it. You need to say, what is your policy? What is the impact of your policy? What is your action items of the policies? You know, what are, and in some capacity, like, are you even monitoring this? Like, okay, you say you're going to have diversity and you say a goal, but is anybody monitoring it? Is anybody paying attention? Have you reached the, you know, like, to me, it's sort of like how private equity comes in and says, okay, did you meet your goals? You know, did you hit your first milestone and things like that? Like, are we seeing that the CEIV credential kind of gives some framework for us, or is it all kind of a work in process?
You know, from that perspective, it's a work in process. But I think what valuation specialists should think about is the impact of these issues on valuation, overall valuation of entities, but specifically as it relates to valuations and financial reporting, measuring the fair value of intangible assets. And, you know, clearly these, you know, for what we've seen and the empirical data is showing is that does have an impact on intangible assets, which relates directly to the CEIV credential.
Yeah. And you know, the reality is that you have to internally quantify it, but you're also saying that there are resources coming out. So just sitting back and being like, well, I don't know if it really does anything, that's not the case anymore. You know, there is data, but then in your own edification, you have to see, okay, we're valuing these trademarks, these patents, this you know, name and things like that. And in the value of that, right? Because, I mean, we have to also put that piece in. So it's sort of like, if you're not including it as, you know, part of your template, if you will, of things that you cover, you might be missing something that's pretty significant.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's something to think about when you're doing your work. Is just add it to your issues that you think about when you're doing evaluation, because it's becoming more and more important.
And start to reach out in some capacity. You know, obviously, I believe that if people are doing financial reporting, that you should be consistent with it and know what you're doing. But this is another area that if you are in this space and you are not giving a lot of thought to ESG, there may be an issue there. And it's going to continue to be an issue. Now, if we have other people that are on the podcast that do have more questions about this, because it's not really my specialty, you know, they could reach out to you. And I think that this is what's going to start happening, even if it's not happening now. It needs to happen more often, because, you know, we as valuation experts need to also help promote the valuation profession, right? And so in some capacity, if people are doing a lot of this work and they're like, ESG, not doing a lot about that, they could reach out to you. Could you tell us more about like your firm and where you're focusing? Because again, if you're doing financial reporting, I think you have to connect with other people around the country that are also doing it, because there's a lot of places that you can mess it up. I don't want to sound scary, but I think there are, right?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think just valuation specialist, has particular impact on valuations for financial reporting just because of the nature of the valuation of intangible assets, but it's eventually impacting all types of valuations just because of the nature. And so as a specialist, again, just be aware that, of the trend, but also it's coming on pretty quickly, and you will start seeing more guidance from the accounting standard setters. We'll probably see better measurement of impact of ESG, and therefore it's going to assist us in our work in measuring the financial valuation impact of these policies. And so just be aware of that's occurring. Start thinking about when you're doing valuations, perhaps asking questions, get a better understanding of a company's policies. And, there's some things that, you can provide advice to your clients that, if your client is not focused on this, that it may impact, long-term viability. They may not be as competitive in the future. So that's, consideration of potential cash flow, potential risk. So it's just right now an awareness stage, but it's coming pretty quickly, and it's something that the profession is working with other standard setters through organizations like the IVSC and in providing a voice of valuation impact on these policies.
But also, I think getting involved, I think that, we've clearly identified that you are involved in national associations, and so am I. And I think that, if this is important, and I think that environmental and social things are of even more importance right now, given the climate and such, that if it is important and you're doing this type of work, that one way to stay kind of ahead of the game, if you will, is to start putting your time into some of these boards and to get involved, because it's going to take input from people who are actually doing the work to make sure that, because in my mind, absolutely you would encounter this in financial reporting, but is it really just a trickle down effect, right? We talk about authenticity in marketing and putting yourself out there, right? Just as whoever you are. And isn't that really a form of authenticity for the company? We're going to put our money where our mouth is, and these are the places that we deem it important. I don't know if we're always asking about those things in a regular valuation, and as they become important for publicly held companies, the trickle down effect is that because I think it's going to raise the standard. Sure. I think you're not going to have, like, we can just sit back and make profits and do nothing. Right? There's going to be sort of a requirement for you to do something more if you're going to, utilize people to make money or products or any of those things. Then you need to start giving back to those same communities or populations in general. So I think it's going to be an area that all of us need to ask more questions about. For sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think society is in general causing these changes, which I think is good. It's not mandated by the government,
right?
Which is good. But society as a whole is changing that. And so they either need to ride the wave, or they're not going to likely may not survive.
Yeah.
And that of course has impact on value. And I think one way to see the impact is just start noticing advertisements in, just sitting watching a football game or something on a Sunday. Just look at the advertisements and look at the focus of the advertisements, and you'll see, companies are trying to enhance their brand, their intangible assets. We're good guys, and here's what we're doing. And it's not. I'm not saying it's lip service. I'm saying they're actually doing things.
I said that the other day. Such a good example. I said the NFL has really come out with much better marketing and advertising and a message. And here's the thing is, as marketing switches to messages from a social or an environmental standpoint is what is connecting with people. And so I think it is huge, but I also think that, eventually it'll be like, okay, well, the other piece is that eventually it will be required, but it will not affect pricing. So I will not pay more for you to be socially responsible. And there's where I think you're going to start to see, okay, we need to still put this outlay of cash to do these things, but it's not resulting in premium pricing because everybody else has to do it too.
Right. Yeah.
So
it'd be more like, if I'm not going to buy from people who don't do this.
Yeah. And what is the impact? And I think that we will have, as we continue with that, we will have more metrics and it kind of falls within like, what we're seeing on social, which is a business owner, a person does something that goes against the brand name, right? And gets crucified personally, but then the brand also does a nosedive. And they could have had nothing. It was just an employee that was a jerk to somebody coming in, and then they recorded it, and it's now on, Facebook or something like that. So I think that the not recording, it's, like the documentation of it as well. So it can't just be lip service. It's got to be actual actions. And then, in your filings, you're going to say, okay, well, here was what we wanted to do, and here's what we did.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's your earlier point, similar to private equity. Did you meet your mark? And this is what you said you were going to do. Did you do it?
Yeah. No, that's awesome. Well, I was interested in this topic, but now I'm like, oh gosh, now there's more things I need to think about in each valuation. But definitely from financial reporting standpoint, if you have questions about this, I would definitely reach out to Mark. He obviously knows way more about it. It took me the entire podcast to get really smart about it. So definitely reach out to him. And Mark, if there's other things that we can talk about in the financial reporting place, then let's do it, because you're really very helpful and very knowledgeable, and we appreciate all of your time and energy. Is there anything else you want to kind of share or offer? Or
no, just it's an exciting opportunity, I think, for valuation. I think this is going to be a big impact in the future for valuation specialists. So start thinking about it.
Yeah, and younger people, and even people who are in like the middle of, the prime of their valuation career, this is a really great time to get involved with being a part of it, of how it's going to change, of the nuances of it, so that everybody gets it right. Everybody wants to sit back and be like, oh, that organization didn't get it right. Well, be a part of it. Be a part of making it right, So, and then you can talk to Mark about that. No, just kidding. Well, this is awesome, Mark. We appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll have you back soon to talk about more fun financial reporting valuation topics.
Well, great. Thanks, Melissa. I appreciate it.
All right.